Welcome to our very first episode of Wire Talk, brought to you by Wirefire. My name is Danielle Cheng, and I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Wirefire. But today, I'm going to be your host. On our show, we hope to spark some discussions around cybersecurity and hopefully inspire you to improve your security posturing as well. Now, before we get into all that, who is Wirefire? Wirefire is a boutique consulting firm located in the heart of Gastown in Vancouver, BC. We are a bunch of engineers and consultants, and what we love to talk about is advanced networking and cybersecurity. So, on today's episode, we welcome our very own cybersecurity analyst, Roslyn, who has some thoughts on endpoint security. Now, Roz, before we dive into our conversation, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience as a cybersecurity analyst?
Hello, everyone. My name is Roslyn. I'm the cybersecurity analyst for Wirefire. My background is in the public education sector, where I used to work in IT. I focus mainly on administering endpoint protection and creating those clever phishing campaigns to train users not to fall for real phishing attacks.
Well, that's exciting. Awesome. So through your experience, you must have seen quite a few things in the cybersecurity space. And in our discussion, I got the sense that you're not terribly impressed when a company just says, we've got endpoint security. Tell me more.
So I don't think that endpoint protection is enough, not even close. So generally, organizations have maintained the traditional mindset when it comes to cybersecurity. So picture this. An employee is issued a company laptop. It's pre-installed with all the company-approved applications and an endpoint protection, or more commonly known as antivirus. The employee is given a default password, maybe a short orientation, and they're thrown into the pit. Get to work. So assuming the involvement of the IT team ends there, then this raises a few questions. Is the employee issued a temporary password, which they are obligated to change during their first login attempt? And if they're obligated to do so, should it be a complex password with minimum 8 characters, include numbers, symbols, lowercase, uppercase? Is the employee required to use multi-factor authentication to add a layer of protection in the event of their password is compromised? If the employee is not allowed to bring home their laptop, does anyone enforce that rule? And if that is the case, is there anything preventing the employee to check their emails on their personal laptop or mobile phones? So if the answer to most of these questions is no, then endpoint protection is not enough.
That is so interesting because due to the weird times that we're living in, most people are not working in a controlled environment like an office space. In fact, they've probably migrated into their living room, bedrooms, kitchens, maybe even a coffee shop. So how has this transformed the endpoint controls?
There is a growing awareness to the gaps left by only relying on endpoint protection. These days, whether organizations were prepared or not, circumstances have accelerated teleworking adoption. So VPN is made available when they're connecting from a non-corporate network. Some have even added an extra layer of protection by subscribing to what we call a CASB solution, so that when employees check their emails or access a SharePoint site of their company on their personal device, there are policies in place to protect the organization's data in the event of a compromise. And when I say compromise, I mean maybe their home Wi-Fi password is 123456, or their device is stolen. Or here's another example. How unlikely is it for an employee's child to know their parent's iPad password? I would argue it's highly likely based on what I've observed from my own friends and family.
Awesome. Now, we're in weird times, like I said before, but it sparked a digital transformation journey like I've never seen before. Organizations are going leaps and bounds into their cloud journey. Tell me, how does this all play in as organizations explore doing business in the cloud?
The positive thing here is cloud adoption has accelerated as well, and that's good because organizations have seen the value in not investing in infrastructure anymore and leave it to Google or Amazon to put up these data centers. But the negative side there's a misconception that once you put your data into those data centers, they're secured. What they don't disclose upfront, I would say then, or at least advertise openly, is that Google, Amazon, they're only responsible for the lower stacks of security for your data. So take physical security. No one can enter their data center, right? But higher levels where it's putting in firewalls in place or securing your data depending on where it travels, that's not covered. So you have to think outside the box, and endpoint protection does not cover any of those.
Oh dear. Okay. So help out someone that might not understand what any of this means, right? In a typical organization, what can this result in for a business leader?
I think the primary concern there will always boil down to money. When your data is leaked, you are basically losing money. And you're not going to get back any of those data, whether you pay ransomware or not. So picture a toothpaste being squeezed out of the toothpaste tube. You're not going to get back those toothpaste into the tube, whether you try hard or not. You can think of it as if you invest properly ahead of time by not just investing in endpoint protection, you put those other layers in place, then you're saving money. Because if you try to deal with the problem after you cross that bridge, after you experience a data breach, these can cost not only thousands, it's millions. And imagine the loss of your credibility as well towards your clients if you experience this when you're in the headlines of CNN that you're the latest company that got breached.
You had me at millions. Awesome. So, in your view, what can leaders do today to bolster their own security posturing?
So 2 things come to mind, and I'll elaborate on each of these points. First is avoid believing that your organization is a special snowflake. And the second is the growing availability of internet connection that allows us to work virtually anywhere is a great advancement, and we should embrace it. So back to that first point. So decision makers get stingy when it comes to budgeting for security, and that's just an evolutionary consequence. Our monkey brain are wired to respond to immediate threats. So when a bear is standing in front of us, then our fight or flight mode kicks in. But cybersecurity threats are much harder to take seriously. It's not tangible. It's so easy to look at the headlines such as Equifax data breach and respond with, oh, but that won't happen to us. We're not as famous as Equifax, so surely hackers wouldn't waste their time on us. Or worse, oh, but they hired a woman as their cybersecurity officer who used to study music composition. They had it coming. And then they go back to cutting budgets without realizing that first, Equifax is not an anomaly. Hackers don't discriminate between small businesses versus Amazon. Every single business that has an online presence is a target. And second, it's so easy to blame breaches to gender or to non-traditional credentials, anything to differentiate ourselves so we can falsely create this us versus them mentality and conclude that we're the exception, but we're not. And given this, there is no excuse to not adopt a defense in depth strategy. What I mean by this is using a series of security mechanisms and controls that are thoughtfully layered to protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And this leads me to my second point about teleworking. Leaders should be realistic about your employees' work style or lifestyle. Leaders should refrain from using outdated methods to address modern cybersecurity threats. So for instance, I used to work in a highly collaborative environment where several people would edit files together. So in general, no one had any issues emailing a Word document back and forth. Just use version control to track changes and the work flowed smoothly. But what happens when the project involves a video? Videos are too heavy to be shared via email. So sharing through OneDrive or SharePoint to external users was prohibited. Do you think that the project was simply dropped because of these restrictions? No. The employee used their personal Google Drive to continue collaborating without the organization's authorization or knowledge. So as a result of these roadblocks that the company put in place to be secure, the employee resorted to riskier methods, not only violating the organization's practices, but rendering the organization non-compliant to regulations where its data should reside within the country. They were better off allowing external sharing, but putting in place layers of security measures like data loss prevention, encrypted sharing methods, etc. So to summarize that, number one, stop believing that your organization is not being targeted. If you're online, then you're targeted. And second, rather than trying to enforce prohibitive measures to stay secure, enable secure flexibility by using defense in-depth practices. Endpoint protection is not enough.
That is a fantastic perspective. And you're right. Lots of people may look at an Equifax breach and be like, that's not me. But the reality is, smaller organizations are probably more likely to get breached because the hackers know that they don't probably spend a lot of money securing their enterprise. And I love what she said about lines of business continuing on their work. It's true. We're all guilty of it. So from a cybersecurity leader perspective, it's probably incumbent on us to be able to work with the lines of business to empower them with security controls to get the job done rather than trying to put up a roadblock. So that's all the time that we've got for today's episode. And I really, really enjoyed the discussion today and learned a lot. Roslyn, thank you so much for your time and joining me for the first episode of WireD Talk.
Thank you for having me.